Hey guys, hey YouTube, welcome back. What we're going to do is we're going to start a whole new series today. We're going to do a little mini series on primitive trapping, triggers, trip lines, all those sorts of things. We're going to start very basic and we're going to work our way up to the more complicated traps. I will basically go through just about all the traps that I can possibly think are actually worthwhile and effective, from things like the SAS handbook. So we're going to work through them. It'll be the first time for me to build a few of these. I've done a lot of them anyways before, but I'll just work through them one by one and we'll see if we can't get them all ticked off, and I'll let you know along the way what I'm learning about them. To understand the components, you can make traps, combining them in different ways. So let's get to it. Primitive traps and primitive trapping in general is pretty much illegal just about all over the world, so it's really good to note right here that none of these traps are going to be used for catching animals. You got to be careful with these things. Traps are indiscriminate killers, so using primitive traps, the things that we're going to do here, I do them purely for the therapeutic side of carving them, putting them together, seeing the functionality, making them work, knowing that I have that sort of tool in my mental toolbox. I would stress right now that you only ever use these in a very life or death extreme situation. They tend to follow one of, or a combination of, 4 principles. With a primitive trap, you either want to mangle, strangle, dangle, and occasionally tangle your prey. Okay, so those are the 4 things we're looking to do. Mangle, drop something heavy on them, mess them up. Strangle, that's pretty self-explanatory. Dangle is when you strangle them, but you also lift them up off the ground. This is a good way to prevent them from chewing through your cordage ground. And when we say dangle, we don't mean that you need to lift them, 7 feet up. You need to get their front paws off the ground to a place where they're incapable of getting turned around on themselves, either loosening off that noose or actually getting their teeth into it and chewing themselves free. Tangle, occasionally, particularly like with fish or occasionally with birds, you can catch them with a net. This keeps them alive. This tangles them up. That's the way that tangle works. Strangle, mangle, dangle, tangle. 4 of those. Now, when building these traps, there are a couple of components that you basically want to understand. Once you've got your head around the components, then, like I say before, you can combine them in different fashions to turn out different traps or adapt them to your situation and your scenario. Most of the traps we're going to work with are going to employ some sort of a snare. Okay, so snare itself is one component, and a snare is just simply a loop of rope back on itself with a slippery knot or a looped knot around the main cord so that it chokes down, tightens up. The harder you struggle, the more it tightens up. That's a snare. You've got the trigger component. The trigger component is the part that holds it all together on the finest of its edges, and this trigger is what's going to pop apart and set off the spring-loaded snares. Now, with snares, you can either go extremely basic and hope for the animal to just straight run into it. That would be just an example of pure strangle. Then you can power your snare by an engine. By engine, in this case, what I mean is some sort of a spring sapling. This is where you're going to get dangle and strangle, okay? Now, a lifting or a powered engine snare is going to be more effective. The engine, as we just explained, is the sapling. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be a sapling. If you don't have a sapling that you can bend down to power your spring, you can also do it by tying a heavy log to a piece of string, passing that string up over a branch and back down. When the trigger lets go, the heavy weight that you've placed on the string comes down, it lifts it up towards the branch that you've suspended it on. So an engine doesn't necessarily have to be a sapling, it can be improvised. Windlass is also a version of an engine, okay, and we'll get into windlasses towards the end of it. And one of the other ones that we're going to do in the series here is going to be deadfalls. Deadfalls employ a crushing action. This is where you get your mangle. You want to have your weight at least 5 times the weight of the animal you intend to catch. Deadfall traps don't necessarily work just by blunt force. They also can work by suffocation. If you get just the heavy weight on the animal, you can just stop it basically from breathing, suffocate it inside of your deadfall trap, and it's gonna do the same job. You're gonna get the animal in the end. So those are a couple of the very basic trap components that we're gonna understand. We're gonna start with the very, very easiest. We're gonna start with an L7 trigger, which is going to be for the very most basic of spring-loaded snare traps. It'll also work just as well on an automated fishing pole. That in the place of having your snare loop, you would have your fishing line to that, and whenever the fish pulls at the L7 trigger, lets go, your sapling goes up, sets the hook. This is the most basic of traps. It's the L7. I'm going to show it to you, and then I'm going to take you through how we made it. Okay guys, this right here is a finished L7 trigger switch. Okay, this is exactly how it works. This is your L. Now this is the number 7 notch. So we've gone straight in here, taken it down. You see how that bears a resemblance to the number 7. And the L hooks inside of it like this. Okay, now this is the ground peg, the 7 is the ground peg. The L is your upwards hook. And this little bit of a notch here is just where my string's going to attach. When the weight is pulled up on it, it pulls against that bottom 7. The L holds it in place. When somebody or something pulls into the snare, it releases these components. This slides out and it allows it to free up, and the engine pulls it up. I'll show you now really quickly how we do these notches, and I'll put one together for you. We'll have a look at it and we'll set it off. Here's our 7 notch. L, and this is the 7. We've mated them up, we see that they work. Now we're just gonna find ourselves a little engine sapling, and we're gonna turn this 7 notch stick into a peg. We're gonna put this in the ground, so we're gonna have to sharpen the bottom end of it here, and we're gonna chamfer off the top end so that when we pound it in, when we pound it into the ground, it doesn't split all apart on it. That's enough to keep it from splitting out on us. And the bottom end, we're just gonna turn into a peg. So for the purposes of this video, guys, I've manufactured a little game trail here, which I've done by just moving some of these, some of the ground cover out of the way here, which we're gonna pretend is our game trail. Okay, so obviously if you're gonna set traps and you intend to catch stuff because you're dying, and that's the only reason that you'd ever be using these, then obviously you're gonna set your traps where there's game, right? Game trails, you'll find those running through the woods and they're quite obvious. Now you gotta figure out what is running on them and adjust the size and orientation of your trap accordingly. So in this case here, what I've done is I've chosen a tiny little wee sapling off the side of my trail, which I've made just for the purposes of it. So my little sapling comes down just above my game trail. So this is my manufactured game trail, okay? This little dark strip here is where it's gonna go. My sapling, when pulled over, comes just down. See my thumb here? It's just down over top of that. So we're going to set our trap off to the side. We're going to do our best to avoid actually trampling or walking onto the trail at any point. I'm going to leave it as clean as possible. We're going to hammer that down into there so it's nice and solid. It's going to be at least strong enough to catch that tree. We're going to start by just tying it up off to the end of this. Do a clove hitch. And we're going to just secure the clove hitch with 1/2 hitch to prevent it from running away or opening up on us. That's that. Next, we've got our L. We're going to come down here and we're going to see how much we need to pull down on this L. That's about right there. So we're going to put a clove hitch in that. Same thing right here. There we go. That's holding together. Let's get you in here. So here's our L7, clove hitch there, string running up to our sapling, tied off with a clove hitch, backed up with a 1/2 hitch up here. And the excess of this string, you'll see it's just off to the side of our game trail here. Now the excess of this string, we're going to put the loop in, and we're just going to suspend that up out in front of the trail. We'll do that for you and we'll set it off. This is our L7 spring trap. over here, we've got our noose, which is sitting directly over the game trail at the appropriate height to catch rabbits. And you see it's facing forward so that the rabbits, as they hop along, they jump in, they go through it, and it's just propped up by a couple of clips. As they move, they pull that off, triggers the noose, tightens it up, lifts them up off the ground. That's your basic L7 trigger trap, sprung loaded. Okay guys, now that we've got the L7 down pat, let's adapt that L7. We can take the L7 trigger as we know it, and we can make it work for 2 traps at the same time. Let's say we've got, we want to double up our chances, and we've got 2 game trails coming out here. Picked a spot in the middle, and I've made my peg. My 7-notch peg is much taller, and I've carved my L notch into the middle of this branch. So I've flattened it off here, and I've flattened it off on this face to make a 90-degree up in this corner. That is the new L. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take my string here coming down from my engine, and I'm going to tie a Y, and I'm going to attach it on this side. So I'm going to rearrange you guys. I'm going to pull this down, I'll tie it up, and we'll show you what it looks like and why it's better. Okay guys and girls, this is our adapted L7 trigger snare. Now we've got the same stick, same sapling. You still see it's lashed up here, it comes down, but down here we've put a split in it, and it's splitting off to the left and right. We've got our much taller ground peg here, which is our 7-notch, and our L notch part of this trigger, instead of being an upright vertical stick, is a horizontal stick that's been flattened off 90 degrees on the top and on the side, and that's hooking in the exact same way, just underneath the little rib of that. And that allows us to have a bit of a spreader bar. So we've got our 2 game trails in this case, one going left, one going right over here, with our little bait thingy, with our little upright in the middle. And then we've got a noose hanging on each side. Now you might just have to work that open, with just a little tiny twig just to keep it propped open and facing oriented so that it's going to catch the rabbit. Now this one here, obviously it's not catching anything, so it's set low. It's set high. Would have to be a little bit lower to be effective, but this way we can cover 2 different tracks. We can either cover the one here going down the right, or we can cover the one over here on the left with 1 trigger stick. That's just sitting in there. It's all under tension, so when anything comes along in either direction from either side and gets into one of these things, it's going to pull on the side of the stick. It's going to pull it off out of its notch, and it's going to trigger. Now obviously only one side's going to catch something at a time, but you are doubling your chances. So that's stuck on there pretty good, and that's lifting me up. It's lifting the rabbit. Whatever, if it's pulling, it's struggling, it's using all of its energy, it's going to succumb to the suffocation, to the strangling much faster. So there it is. That's a bit of an adaptation. That there is our adaptation to the single L7 trigger trap. 2 trails, 1 trap with a crossbar, 2 nooses.